and those people that might be online. I'll go to my right, Joe.
Joe Terry, Director of Public Works.
Ryan Giefer, Wastewater Superintendent.
Tim DeSorsi, Finance.
Shane Blazer, Mayor.
Thad Kubiszak, Committee Member.
Okay, those members online.
Tom Realm, District 4 Alderman.
Dean Veneman, District 2 Alderman.
I think, Dean, you're sitting in for Steve tonight, right?
That's what he asked, yeah.
On the committee, okay. Okay, we'll go on to, like I said, number 2, we review the wastewater budget. Ryan?
Okay, so I just handed out some bullet points that I put together, mostly outlining any changes to the line items, and then also going over a description of all the outlay items for 2021. So I guess instead of going through it line by line, since some of them are largely unchanged, I'll go through the bullet points that talk about the changes, if that's good with everybody. So the first item I have on there is the biosolids drying pad. So that's where we store our finished cake biosolids, our Class A biosolids. Now I increased that slightly, and actually I don't have the, how much should I increase that by? Oh, wages. I increased the wages that I budgeted slightly just because we're producing more Class A biosolids at the moment, so the DPW employee that's out there turning it with the compost turning, moving it around, loading trucks when they come, is spending more time, so we're overspending that budget slightly. So I increased that, but to that same effect, I actually decreased the actual disposal costs by $5,000. Because we've had some successes with the Class A program in the last year. We actually have 100% of the material being picked up by local farmers and some local trucking companies for their usage. So we've essentially cut our hauling costs down to zero. So it's a line item that could be reduced further, but I don't want to be too aggressive, so I left $5,000 in there. And that's a number that 3 years ago was about $50,000. So we've been making some nice progression with the Class A biosolids and finding a market for the product and getting it to go away by itself. So we're happy with that. So that was the second bullet point, decrease of 50%. Building maintenance at the actual plant. So if you're looking at the line items, that's 53401 is the wastewater treatment plant. Building maintenance, we increased $5,000 this year. We've been trending slightly above the typical $15,000 that we budget every year, so now it's $20,000. We've got some, the last upgrade at the facility was in 2010, so some of our HVAC equipment, we're seeing a lot of repairs that are needing to happen, so I bumped that up slightly more in line with the 3-year average. Materials was another $5,000 increase. Again, that was a number that's been trending up a little bit the last 3 years, so I just want to kind of bring that to where I think it's appropriate. Chemicals has been a big discussion over the last few years. We were fortunately able to project a decrease of about $20,000 for chemical usage. So that goes from 250 down to 230, and the projection is actually a bit below 230, but again, didn't want to get too aggressive at this point in case something changes. Most of that has been some of the operational improvements we've been able to find via several in-house initiatives. So we've really been having some success in reducing not only our cationic polymer flocculants for our thickening and dewatering equipment, but also the actual chemical we use for phosphorus removal. We've been able to decrease its use via other means of process adjustments. UV disinfection, we did increase that one a little bit more substantially. That's typically a $15,000 a year line item. We moved it to 25, largely because that system, marking 10 years of age, the manufacturer recommends several overhauls to that system. Hydraulic ram replacements, some of the quartz sleeves that houses the ultraviolet bulbs need to be replaced, some seals. It's kind of an overhaul year for that system. So we're going to need to spend a little bit more money on it, but it's been a fairly, until the last few years, it's been a fairly low-cost system, but now we're starting to see the replacement things needing to happen. I should probably just say it. Stop me with any questions anybody has. I'm kind of rolling through here. Electric costs at the facility, reduced that by $5,000. That's typically $180,000 a year budget. We brought it down to $175,000. It's projecting to be a bit lower than that this year, largely because we've been through the initiative to take more high-strength waste at the facility, like fats, oils, and greases, and food-grade waste, and put it into our digesters. We've been making more biogas, more methane, and H2S, which allows us to run our CHP generator at a higher kW output, and that also creates more heat to be reused throughout the facility, and more heat for our TPAD process. So we're able to save some money, not only electricity, but also heating by running that CHP faster. So that next line item decreased to $10,000 to the heating line item for the same reason. So those are the really only significant changes, some up, some down to the line items, but remaining somewhat unchanged. If you flip to the next page, it outlines the outlay for this year, which are things that we're looking at future needs, some replacement and some capital investment, a lot of it coming out of the replacement account from the facility. So I'll just go through these line by line, and just please stop me if you want to discuss it further or have questions or want to go back and talk about something else. So the first item on there, the SCADA, dialer alarm software upgrade. SCADA stands for Supervisory, Control, and Data Acquisition. So that's the means by which we monitor remote lift stations, monitor the plant when we're at home at night, can do some remote control of different things in the facility. So I can log in at 8 o'clock before bed and change things if they seem like they need to be changed. I mean, it's a lot of flexibility. The dialer system that calls you when there's an alarm has aged to the point where it's no longer receiving support from its software developer. So we need to upgrade it. It's something we could gamble and keep, but I'm not comfortable really not being supported. So the number I got from the manufacturer was $19,600. I got one competitive quote for $22,000, and we're pretty happy with this current dialer we have. So I'd like to invest in that on a new dialer for next year. Daily lift station is an aging lift station. It's probably about our oldest current lift station. It's in need of new pumps and a new control system, and likely some new piping as well. We might have to cut some ductile iron out and replace it with stainless steel, hopefully. Altogether, the number for labor, some new piping, a new control panel, floats, transducers, and pumps came to $53,400 on the low end. I had a couple other contractors come in higher than that. But this was a mix of Econ Electric, Haza Mechanical, and us doing some of the work. So kind of piecemealed, but it was definitely the best way to go as far as cost goes, and I'm comfortable working with those contractors. So that's the direction I hope to go with daily for next year. Digester cover level sensor replacement. So if you've ever been to the facility, we have 3 anaerobic digesters, 2 thermophilic, 1 mesophilic. And those digester covers, 2 of them are 90 feet, one's 130 feet in diameter. They float on the methane gas that we produce, which is then stored in the covers, which is what makes them move up and down. That level, so the cable that's driving the value that we're getting to know where the cover is what tells all of our equipment how much gas we have in the system. So we rely on it very heavily. And that technology, frankly, is pretty much obsolete. I'd like to replace them with some radar units that actually send down like a transducer type signal, and it hits the cover. What we have now is physical hardware, cables moving in and out of conduit with rollers and things. So it's not real reliable, and we've been having a lot of issues with it. And the issues that come typically have a lot of downstream effect on generator speed, whether or not the boiler's firing on and off. It's just, there's a lot of components to the facility that rely on that. So the quote I got was 14.5 to replace all 3 of those units, and I think it's well worth the investment. So the next item is a thin client computer replacement. So kind of along the lines of the SCADA dialer alarm system that's obsoleted. We have a few what are called thin client computers throughout the facility, which are basically they're computers that sit in the panels, the control panels throughout different buildings. We have 3 of them, one in the RAS building, one in the blower building, and one in the building 150. And those computers are about 11 years old now. 2 of them have pretty much failed. We can get them going with enough kind of jury rigging, but we need to spend some money and replace them, get new screens for them and new computers, new processors. We do have a couple options. We could look at buying a few iPads and getting Wi-Fi in all the buildings and just doing it on an iPad and not having a physical computer. I think that's a better way to go. It's a lot cheaper. It's about $39,000 for all of that. All the computers, as I outlined in there, to actually physically replace the computers in kind is about $85,000. So the guys are pretty comfortable. The operators at the facility say, yeah, iPads would be nice. You're more mobile. We do need to, like I said, get Wi-Fi there for that to work. But I think that's the best route moving forward would be to do something with iPads and be mobile like that. So for about $39,000, we could retrofit the system with mobile tablets. Okay, so the next 2, if I know I sent the alder persons the Black and Veatch Phase 1 and 2 facility reports, I think it was last Friday, so I didn't give you a lot of time, and we don't need to get too far into it tonight, but in that report, Black and Veatch, the consultant we're working with, outlined a couple things we could do to move towards compliance with our future phosphorus permits, which in the report, it outlines we're going to go from a 1 milligram per liter effluent phosphorus concentration, which we've had at this facility for 30 years, to a 0.35 likely. That's not in concrete, but that's likely. And we need to achieve that by 2025. And we need to be documenting the DNR that we're doing things starting this year and every year until then. So one of the things was contracting with Black and Veatch. The next thing was optimizing our current facility, and now we're getting into actually needing to do some different things. So the first thing is this post-digestion treatment technology that I'm referencing. And what it is, I don't want to get too far into the weeds, but we have the tankage currently at the facility to take all the anaerobic digested solids we have, put them in these tanks that are relatively unused now, and you fill them up, you leave the anaerobic treated solids in there for 5 to 10 days, and you cycle air to them. And it's no more complex than that, but what happens when you're cycling anaerobic and aerobic bacteria, you get the formation of what's called a Acinetobacter anammox bacteria that will bond to and destroy ammonium. And if we can do that because we have the tankage, we have the blowers, we have everything we need, we would simply need to somehow get the air into the tank. We could essentially eliminate 90% of the ammonia that's moving through the facility, which is probably 80% of our blower costs. So it'd be a huge savings on electricity from our blowers running from ammonia air demand. And it would also make meeting our new ammonia permit, it would solve that. If it worked the way we're hoping it works, we would need to do no further action for our tightening ammonia permit. So I think it's worth, we have the tank, usually facilities when they do this type of upgrade, they have to build the tank, put in an aeration grid, buy blowers, you're talking millions, $1 million to $2 million. I think we could do it for probably well under $57,000, but if there's some challenges with our current plan, we may need to spend a bit more. But for that investment, I think what we can achieve, that the ROI would be ridiculous. It would pay for itself within the first 2 years. So I think it's worth trying for sure is what we're getting at. And this is kind of a demonstration. If we do this, if we get air into the tank, if we control the blowers, and we destroy all the ammonia in our side stream coming back, we need to go a little bit further and make it permanent. But for that, probably under 50,000, probably under 30,000, we can try it, is what I'm getting at. And then the investment beyond that wouldn't be significant, but you'd want to make it a more permanent installation. So I'm proposing that we try to do this post-digestion treatment technology, largely because we already have 90% of the equipment, and we have the manpower to do a lot of the work ourselves. So the last one, now this is the phosphorus side of things that I was sort of referencing earlier. Our current permit, like I said, is going to be 1 milligram per liter going down to 0.35. The best we can do with our chemical system we have, so we chemically treat for phosphorus. We have polyaluminum chloride that you pump in and it binds with phosphorus and it settles out in your solids. What Black & Veatch has suggested was through different processes, and RAS fermentation is one, you could promote biological phosphorus removal with your bacteria you currently have. Some of the other facilities I've worked at, like Stevens Point and Wapaka, that's the way our systems were designed, was to remove biologically, not chemically. There's challenges with chemical and biological, but if you can try to do both, which is what we would be attempting to do here, it would make achieving 0.35 milligrams per liter realistic with our current setup. And this would be a demo, so we would be spending about $100,000 to try it. The full scale, if it works, the full scale investment would be quite a bit more. But what we basically need to do is you take your return activated sludge, that's what RAS is. So that's the bugs that you've settled out of your system, they've done the treatment, now you're returning them back to do it again. You take a portion of those bacteria, and because we have extra tankage at the facility, we'd be pumping them into an unused tank, pumping a little bit of primary effluent into them, and then cycling air again. You're creating an anaerobic, aerobic situation, and what happens is you get fermentation of the bacteria. When they ferment, they release phosphorus, and then you get PAO growth, phosphorus accumulating organism growth. So acinobacters and nitrobacters start to grow, and they start to suck up phosphorus into their bodies. So what we would essentially be doing was removing 80 to 90% of the incoming total phosphorus, and now you only have that 20% remaining. You hit that with enough chemical, we would potentially be solving our phosphorus compliance issue. But that's a big question mark. We'd need to do this for 3, 4, maybe 5 months, and it would take some digging, some teeing into some pipes, some control on the air valves. There's some work that would need to be done to retrofit the facility to do it. But again, I think when in the report it outlines if we're not able to achieve the new permit with our current facility, we'd be looking at tertiary filtration, which is in that $5, $6, maybe $7 million range. So in my opinion, spending $100,000 now to try and see if we can avoid a $5, $6, $7 million investment in 3, 4 years, I think it's well worth it. Now, obviously, if it works extremely well, we're going to need to spend a little bit more to make it a permanent type situation. But I'm pretty excited to try it if everyone's on board with trying it. And Black & Veatch did perform modeling with modeling software, and it did suggest it would be successful, but we just won't know for sure until we do it, until we try it. So I threw a lot at everybody in a hurry there. What questions are there on everything? And in the report, if you read the report I sent, there's some actual diagrams that physically outline exactly what we're going to try to do, where the piping would need to be changed, what tankage would be, and I didn't include that, but it is in the emailed report. What physical changes we'd actually make, where we'd make them, and it goes into how we would make them as well. So for more information, the Phase 2 Black & Veatch report would be worth reading.
Does anyone have any questions for Ryan? Mr. Kubiak?
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson. Ryan, thank you for coming down. A lot of times we don't have the pleasure to listen to you. And in the past wastewater operators that I've known, I just picked up, you said the word excited. You're excited to try something out. I've always found that wastewater operators have been excited about doing their job, working at, I build wastewater treatment plants, but I know zero about it. But there's a scientific element with that. But so when I ask this question or ask these questions, I'm not trying to put you on the spot, but it's to get your take in terms of a layman version of the reports that you sent and in terms of the phosphorus limits that the state is requiring. Can you explain, give a little bit of background, because I think that's one of the things that the public doesn't necessarily know, or even most of the people in this room understand. You know, there's little hot button topics that we talk about, taxes and different things like that, but this is something that's very serious and moving forward. And especially if the state of Wisconsin, or DNR, or whoever you want to call it, is putting limits on point source discharge versus non-point discharge, you know, whether it's in the Wisconsin River or whether it's our own watershed, or it's something that we as municipalities, cities and villages need to really, or at least the leaders of cities and villages need to pay attention to, because this is something that could cost us $6,000, $7,000, or $6, $7, $8 million as we move forward if we don't get it right. And we want to obviously get it right, but and again, the question is, you know, it's, can you elaborate kind of on this whole thing? Where did it come from? It doesn't have to be a 30-minute presentation, but kind of a, you know, where did this initial phosphorus come from? Why is it just targeted at a point source versus non-point source, and explain what non-point source is if you feel comfortable. I mean, I'll be the one, and non-point source is farms. You know, point source is wastewater treatment plants, and the problem is that Wisconsin doesn't look at farms with all the runoff that goes into the Wisconsin River or any other watershed, so they're not targeting that. But what can we do as informed citizens, but also informed city leaders or elected officials on the city council? How can we influence this potentially? Because although, like you had suggested, it's 0.35 right now, but this is something that could potentially change. You know, it's through the administrative rule process making with the DNR, but they're getting, the DNR also gets their influence by the state legislature, and is that something that we can also write our state legislators and say, listen, you know, we're unfairly being taxed as being cities and villages who have wastewater treatment plants versus this non-point source runoff that's going into the watersheds. But I guess, like I said, it's kind of a roundabout question. But can you just elaborate on this whole phosphorus deal a little bit, Ryan? Thank you.
Yeah, and Joe can probably help me with some of it too. As far as where it all started, do you know the actual, there was a legislator?
Yeah, it was a legislative action. I actually attended the hearings down in Madison on behalf of municipalities expressing concern because it isn't uniform or fair. But the general idea is that if phosphorus levels in the waters are reduced to a certain amount, the water quality improves. Phosphorus is in a lot of things, including any kind of animal waste in fairly significant amount. The rule that the state put together took into account that if point and non-point sources reduce their phosphorus levels, we could see some improvement in water quality in our lakes, rivers, and streams and impoundments. The problem that you articulated is that there aren't ways currently to enforce any of those rules in agriculture. And so the fact of the matter is this tiny amount of reduction that municipalities are going to do, us as point sources, at an extreme cost is going to result in very little to no change in water quality. It was in the late 90s when the first phosphorus rules were passed, and the municipalities, the point sources, the factories, the municipal wastewater treatments did make they were a significant contributor. I think at that time it was about 70% of the phosphorus was coming from point sources. Now the point sources contribute about 20%. And the little amount that we're able to actually reduce is going to come at great cost. This project could cost upwards of $9 to $12 million all in. So the report that Ryan had passed out, it is fairly extensive, but what it does do is define a path for the city. And part of that path is some testing, and with that, there's a cost to that. You know, for next year, that $100,000 project, I'd feel a whole lot more comfortable with $100,000 in the budget if we had some guarantees. Well, what the guarantee is it will know whether or not this process will be effective at our plant. And compared to a $9 to $12 million project, this $100,000 could turn this whole thing into about a $2.5 to $3 million project. So it's still an awful lot of money. And in my professional opinion, after attending numerous hearings, I was on the DNR panel, the Municipal Wastewater Association group that met in Plover for well over a year. There will be no water quality benefit with the tiny amount that we're reducing. So, you know, that is something that I think is a message that needs to get passed on to our elected officials. There is no one more passionate than your wastewater crew as far as being environmentally responsible and positive. I mean, that's what these guys are doing for their profession, is cleaning wastewater. And the level to which it's cleaned and sent in the river is better quality than the water that's in the river. So it's, you know, I think a lot of this particular rule is a feel-good thing. But the fact of the matter is, it's been in play for a long time. There has been a study that the DNR has established a total mass discharge limit for various point sources along the river. Again, it's theoretical. It's also takes into account the ag that would need to get to the appropriate level. So I think this is premature. I think that the city will invest an awful lot of money into something that will actually be worn out and replaced before the actual phosphorus sources that are making a significant contribution to the algal blooms in our lakes, rivers, and streams will be addressed. But we don't have a choice at this point unless there are some extraordinary measures by our elected officials to reverse course. But this is a lot of money, and we have been discussing rates. You know, in the past year and a half, we've negotiated rates and updated our contracts with our industrial customers. We've developed a proposed contract with the Village of Buren. That is still not quite ready for council review and approval. We're waiting for input or response back from Village of Buren from the draft that our staff and attorney and hired legal has done. But we are looking at the need to adjust rates. And while we're focusing on the expense side of wastewater, we do have some changes and some things that we have to look at from a revenue standpoint. We'll get into details on that a bit later. We still have some documents to prepare and to substantiate, but at this point in time, we're looking at roughly a 5% increase is necessary. And we're also going to propose that because we've gone and changed our wastewater utility to an enterprise fund, that accrual accounting is a little bit different. And meeting with our finance director, we feel that we should have an accountant that helps and has specific expertise in accrual wastewater enterprise funds to assist us in making a rate review that takes into account these projects that are outlined over the next, 5 to 10 years. And so that we can have fairly stable rates and rate adjustments so that over time we don't have, like even now, we did not put together a rate review for last year. And so what we're going to propose is higher than what we'd like to see. I don't like to see more than a 1 or 2% per year. But that's something that we do have to face, and we do want to be responsible about it. We are required by our permit to have responsible wastewater rates, and we're also required by the Clean Water Fund loans that we have obtained over the years for improvements. The West Side Lift Station, the plant improvements itself. That we have to have a sustainable rate structure. It can't be subsidized. So it's probably a long answer to a relatively short question, but hopefully that helps clarify.
The only thing too that I would add a little bit to some of that would be the DNR has in the past used the end user, I guess you'd call us, as a vehicle sometimes to accomplish other things. With the with the mercury limits that came down, I don't know about in Rapids, but like in Wapaka, a smaller facility, right as I left, it was coming down. So within the last 10 to 15 years, they hand down a mercury limit, and then they say, okay, now the operators of the wastewater treatment facility need to go into the community, to the dental offices, and do inspections on amalgam separators, make sure they have chairside traps for any mercury fillings, go to the industrial customers in the city and make sure they're properly managing mercury. And with this phosphorus thing, it was another thing where, okay, your limit's going to be probably unattainable. One of the options is there's adaptive management and there's trading. And you can go out to farmers potentially, work with them on putting in clay banks so their runoff isn't going into the stream, help them reduce their phosphorus impact to the waterways. The issue for a utility of this size is that there's not a lot of small farms that we'd be able to work with that affect the Wisconsin River nearby where it'd be feasible to work with them. And they really place no value on, in case we reduce 1 pound of phosphorus runoff from a farmer, what does that look like on a credit on their end? They really didn't have an answer. So it doesn't make sense for us as staff to try to go out and find a farmer that would work with us, who's going to bear most of the financial burden. How is it going to work? How are we going to test it? I mean, it's kind of a mystery bag, but it's another way that they may be trying to use us to try to help them with non-point as well. And then trading for us, it's not something that you have to actually identify other impaired contributors to your watershed. So there's a few small creeks upstream but nothing that would do really anything in terms of giving us credit in pounds of effluent phosphorus. So we're in a boat where the other options aren't feasible. So we're going to probably have to do something in the fence. But they also, when they did the TMDL, they did another thing, and I don't know if it was a result of some lawsuits or exactly how it worked, but site-specific criteria came down. So the initial TMDL and the water quality effluent-based limits that we got, and a lot of facilities got throughout the facility, was 0.075, which is, sometimes filtration can't get you that low. And then I'm not sure the process that came to site-specific criteria, but then they went around to other facilities and said, okay, what's a semi-realistic number? And ours came out at 0.35. So there has been some movement away from the initial number of 0.075, which was just about unrealistic, to now 0.35, which in my opinion was a number that they looked at what we have, chemical phosphorus removal. If you hit that with all the chemical you can possibly hit it with, you might get close, not a guarantee, but they kind of put it where it's semi-attainable. So there's a lot of different things going on, and it's just going to be a challenge, but it's already in our permit now that we have a compliance schedule. So at this point, for us to change that would be very difficult, but, I think the only probably real options for the city residents would be to talk to representation, but it's not been something that they've shown a lot of flexibility on. So hopefully that answers a little bit of it. And actually, before we get too far down the road, next year would be some demonstration testing and trying some smaller things. Before we get into spending millions, it might be worth having Black and Veatch and Joe and I put together an actual, presentation on it and all the background and all the history and all the options, so we can really get a better idea of everything we have on the table. But for this year, it's more of a, what happens if we do this, and can we find a shortcut here, kind of.
Thank you. And just and Mr. Terry, I although it was a long explanation, I think it was absolutely fine. So don't worry. That was the kind of question that I was asking for, that I was seeking for the answer. Mr. Giefer, I'm glad that you pointed out that the 0.075, because what we've now obtained in our the 0.35 is nearly 5 times the limit that we can do, and that's one of the things that we as elected officials can talk with our state officials, whether there is any push-pull or anything further with that. But .075 was a ridiculous number to begin with that the state had came out with. But let me just, since, Mr. Terry, since you kind of brought it up, how our wastewater accounting is going to an enterprise fund and with business type activity method of accrued accounting. Now as we move forward in terms of specifically with the budget aspect, and maybe Tim, you got a little bit of background or whatever, how are we going to move forward with the asset or any asset recoveries as far as that goes? And without specifically looking at the audit report from last year, I don't have any numbers in the top of my head, but do we have to have a certain surplus now? Because I assume when it was still underneath the general fund, and when I used the suggestion that the general fund may have been subsidizing the wastewater plant in between times for cash flow purposes if we weren't bringing in receipts, or is it a case where now, and obviously it's going to be the segregation of funds with it being an enterprise fund, that it won't be under the guise of the general fund. So then if there is budget shortfalls, or if there is, how are we going to manage that? Or is that, I'm sorry, is that the suggestion why we would be looking at it, having a different bookkeeper or an advanced bookkeeper or someone else, maybe a firm that would do it? Or what is the kind of background or the suggestion that we'd be moving forward with having an accountant with that background of a crude method of accounting?
Well, basically, before the wastewater, the sewer utility was accounted for as a special revenue fund. So it was segregated from the general fund, and the general fund was not subsidizing the sewer utility in any way. That it was a separate fund. The revenues that were generated at the plant paid for all the expenses at the plant, plus any of the clean water fund loan payments. But the more correct way, even though it's an allowable way to account for the sewer utility, it should be set up as an enterprise fund, similar to what the water utility is over at Water and Light. And that was last year, the year before was like the first year where we had to do that transition. But part of that transition is that we had to capture as much as possible all the assets of the utility, and that includes all the assets underground. So we had to do some estimating. It's my recommendation that basically what I would like to see is bringing in a financial consultant, such as like an Ellers, where they have people that are strictly dedicated to utilities, and really doing that 5-year financial plan and looking at the rate structure, so that ensure that we're calculating the proper rates, even looking at generating a rate of return that can be used to fund future projects, similar like what they do at the Water and Light through the PSC, where they have a rate of return, return on their assets and things, and just ensure that, okay, we have the proper rate structure for the long-term integrity of the facility, but also then accounting for, with some of the costs that we'd have coming down, is that financial plan is like, how are we going to address those, and what's that going to look like for rates based on a various scenarios of whatever ends up happening with the phosphorus project.
Thank you, Tim. And I guess just one quick follow-up on that in terms of if, because the cool thing is that we're not mandated by the state of Wisconsin Public Service Commission to be regulated as a sewer department. Now, we could if we wanted. I think that there's like 8 different sewer utilities in the state of Wisconsin that are voluntarily being regulated by the PSC. But so then what you're suggesting is that we would set a rate increase schedule for like 5 years ahead. Now, we don't necessarily even have to do that, because we could adjust it annually. And even if we, because we're not regulated, we could even raise it or lower it semi-annually or even quarterly type of a thing. But what you're suggesting is that we want to have someone come in and take a look at it, so that if we did raise rates 3%, 4% in the next couple of years, and then now we got a major expenditure, we don't want to be raising at 30% and 30%, we want to be able to get it, maybe if it's got to be 10%, 10%, because that's what the PSC does. If you do have a major rate increase study done, then they want to build in that I shouldn't use the word profit, but above and beyond revenue generation, just in case, for future unexpected costs with that. So that's what you're kind of suggesting.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like I said, laying out that financial plan, anticipating what we have for capital type expenditures down the road. And yes, absolutely, you want to plan ahead so that you don't have that spike in rates because of a major project, you know, because obviously if you go to get a clean water fund loan, they're going to make you set the rates that they feel is appropriate to cover your operation and maintenance plus whatever the debt payments are. So I think it would just be very prudent for us to have that. Also, it then provides us with a template going forward to maintain it and a structured way to calculate rates that's both accurate and transparent.
Real quick, when are you thinking about a timeline, something like after January 31st, when it kind of slows down?
Yeah, we're talking, we're going to set up just a meeting just to kind of, you know, with Ellers to see what, you know, they have to offer in that aspect. And then, you know, hopefully like early next year's, depending on, you know, timing of everything, that hopefully we could start that process.
Cool, thank you. That's all I got, Mr. Chairperson. Thank you.
I really want to thank you for all your explanations. I mean, for the people at home, the viewers, if they ever have questions about their rate and so forth, the explanations that you gave are fantastic, and they can always refer to this particular copy for further reference. So any alderman at home that have a question? Tom or Dean?
Well, I don't. I heard it all, and some I've known before, so.
Okay, Mr.
Yep.
Burton.
Pretty well explained, pretty clear and concise. Thank you.
Okay, Mayor?
Sorry, I just thought of this. Is the old lift station still considered part of wastewater on the west side? And if so, is there any discussion or thought to what our plans are for that building?
So the wastewater utility doesn't really have a use for it. We have talked briefly about, you know, the city's future use for that building, if there is any. And if there isn't, it's likely still to be a wastewater expense because the building was going to be taken down by the utility. So the future of that building still is uncertain. From a staff perspective, we really don't have a lot of use for it right now. Our sign shop staff is down there. We would like to move them to the city garage campus so that all of our staff, at least most of our staff, is working in one location. And that building is going to require a significant amount of upgrades over the years. But I think the future of that building will be ultimately a discussion for the Finance and Property Committee. And I anticipate in the near future, there'll be some staff recommendations, and then the committee can review and follow up. We have a few buildings that we need to talk about, including this one and the old Humane Society building too, that we need to run in front of the committee and make some decisions for the future of those.
Okay, any other questions or comments? Our third item on the agenda is adjournment. I move to adjourn.
Second.
All those in favor, say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, ayes have it. We're adjourned at 5:48.